Good evening, and welcome to Kindred History. I'm glad you're here. However your day has been, whatever thoughts are still circling, whatever the hour happens to be where you are, you don't need to carry all of it for the next little while. Let the room grow a touch quieter. Let your breathing settle into its own rhythm. There's nowhere else you need to be. We're not beginning with a battlefield, not with cannon fire, not with speeches or banners or marching boots. We're beginning with something much smaller, quieter. A room, a document left open on a table. Voices speaking freely because they believe they are unobserved. And a woman standing nearby. A woman no one in that room is truly seeing. History often teaches us to look at the loudest figures, the presidents, the generals, the men whose names fill textbooks. But sometimes the course of events bends in the presence of someone who never raises her voice. Tonight, we're sitting with one of those lives, not rushing, not dramatizing, simply unfolding it slowly. If you find comfort in stories told at an unhurried pace, if you enjoy letting history move gently in the background as the world grows dim, you're in the right place. So let's travel, quietly, to Richmond, Virginia, the 1860s, a city tightening under the strain of war, brick houses and gas lamps, carriages in the street, whispers behind closed doors, and at the center of it all, a woman almost no one noticed. Her name was Mary Bowser, and to understand how she came to stand in that room, unnoticed, underestimated, we have to go back. Back before the war, before the whispered strategies, before the polished tables and guarded doors, back to the beginning of her life. Mary Bowser was born into slavery in Richmond, Virginia, around 1840. Richmond would later become the capital of the Confederacy. But when Mary was born, it was simply a southern city shaped by tobacco warehouses, brick townhouses, church bells, river trade, and the constant machinery of slavery. Horse hooves struck cobblestone streets. Church steeples pierced the skyline. Auction blocks stood not far from places of prayer. She was enslaved by the Van Loo family. To be born enslaved meant that the law did not recognize you as a person in full. It meant your labor could be sold, your family separated, your future decided by someone else's will. Mary's earliest years unfolded inside a system designed to limit her world. But history is rarely simple. Elizabeth Van Loo, the daughter of the household, would grow into something unusual, a white Southern woman who quietly opposed slavery and later supported the Union cause. Mary grew up in a house where the rules of the South still applied. She was enslaved. She had no legal rights. Her body and labor were owned. Yet Elizabeth Van Loo saw something in her: intelligence, curiosity, presence. Accounts suggest Mary displayed unusual brightness from a young age, an attentiveness that went beyond obedience. She noticed details. She retained information. She listened carefully when adults spoke. And in an act that was radical for the time, Van Loo arranged for Mary to be educated. Not simply taught to recognize letters, educated. Mary was sent north, possibly to Philadelphia, where she attended school in a Quaker environment. For an enslaved black girl in the 1840s, this was extraordinary. Quaker communities often opposed slavery and believed in the spiritual equality of all people. In that northern classroom, Mary would have encountered ideas forbidden in much of the South: literacy as liberation, thought as autonomy, memory as strength. Imagine her sitting at a wooden desk, a slate in her hands, the careful shaping of letters becoming words, words becoming sentences, sentences becoming understanding. Literacy was power, memory was power, observation was power. She learned to read quickly. She learned to write clearly. She learned to listen closely. But education in that era was not protection, it was preparation. And history rarely tells you in advance what you are being prepared for. Childhood in bondage was not only labor, it was instruction in silence. To survive meant learning when to speak and when not to, when to lower your gaze, when to appear smaller than you were, when to let others underestimate you. These were not lessons written in books. They were lessons absorbed in kitchens, courtyards, back stairwells, and long afternoons of quiet work. Mary would have learned the rhythms of the household, the creak of floorboards that announced an approach, the difference between casual conversation and guarded speech, the tone that meant anger, the tone that meant carelessness. Enslaved people were forced to observe constantly. Observation was survival. And when she returned from the North, educated, literate, sharper than ever, she carried two worlds within her, the world that denied her personhood and the world that had shown her she possessed it. She understood how white society saw her. She understood how it did not see her. That double awareness, painful, complicated, precise, would become one of her greatest strengths. Richmond itself grew heavier as the 1850s closed. Conversation shifted. Men spoke more openly about secession. Newspapers printed arguments about sovereignty and states' rights. The language of division sharpened. For those enslaved within the city, rumors traveled differently. Whispers passed between workers in kitchens and carriage houses. War was discussed not as politics, but as possibility. Possibility of chaos, possibility of change, possibility of danger. Mary lived inside that tension. She did not yet know how she would be asked to serve history, but she had already been shaped by forces that demanded composure under pressure. The skills she gathered were not loud. They were not dramatic. They were steady. And steadiness in times of upheaval can be more powerful than force. And as the years moved forward, the city around her began to change. The tension in the air thickened. The future she had been unknowingly prepared for began to take shape. At some point before the Civil War, Mary was legally freed. Freedom, however, did not mean safety. To be free in the 1850s as a black woman in Virginia was to live in a space between vulnerability and watchfulness. Laws restricted movement. Surveillance was constant. Suspicion lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. When war erupted in 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union. Richmond transformed almost overnight. Soldiers marched through its streets. Government officials arrived with urgency and ambition. Homes became offices, churches became hospitals. Whispers of strategy traveled through parlors and public squares. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, moved into the Confederate White House. War sharpens loyalties. It narrows choices. Elizabeth Van Lew chose her side. She became a Union spy, and she turned to Mary. Pause here for a moment. Mary had been enslaved in Virginia. She had tasted education. She had experienced freedom. She could have stepped back. She could have chosen safety. She could have avoided the center of conflict. Instead, she stepped toward it. Why? Because war is not only fought with rifles and cannons, it is fought with information, movements of troops, supply shortages, political divisions, timing. And Mary Bowser possessed something rare. She could move unnoticed. And so the path narrowed. The quiet skills she had gathered, literacy, memory, composure, were about to be tested in ways no classroom could have predicted. Mary was placed in the Confederate White House, not as a guest, not as a clerk, as a servant. Under the name Ellen Bond, she worked inside Jefferson Davis's household. The Confederate White House was not merely a residence. It was a nerve center. Decisions that shaped battlefields were debated within its walls. Messages arrived daily. Officers came and went. Maps were unrolled across polished tables. And in that environment, hierarchy was rigid. To the Confederate elite, she was invisible, a black woman in service, uneducated, unimportant. They did not lower their voices. They did not hide their papers. They did not imagine she could read. But she could. And not only could she read, she possessed what multiple accounts later described as a near-photographic memory. She would enter rooms quietly. She would dust surfaces. She would adjust chairs. She would refill lamps. And while doing so, she observed. Documents left open, letters awaiting reply, troop deployments sketched in ink, supply routes marked in careful lines. She would listen to conversations in passing, not interrupting, not reacting, memorizing troop movements, strategies, supply shortages, weaknesses. And then she would leave. She carried no obvious notes, no hidden parchments tucked in sleeves, no coded scraps sewn into hems. She carried memory. Back in Richmond, Elizabeth Van Lew maintained a network of Union informants. Information moved quietly through coded messages and hidden channels. Eggshells were used to conceal notes. Laundry deliveries masked exchanges. Ordinary gestures carried extraordinary meaning. What Mary heard in the halls of Confederate power did not stay there. It traveled north. And imagine the tension of those moments. A servant crossing a threshold, a glance at a document, a pause long enough to absorb. Then stillness, stillness that concealed precision. What she carried out of those rooms was not simply information. It was something larger, something that would ripple far beyond a single household. Day after day, the rhythm repeated. Boots in corridors, papers stacked and restacked, maps unrolled and smoothed flat beneath careful hands, candles burning low into the evening. Officers leaned over polished tables, tracing supply routes with their fingers. Ink dried slowly on official correspondence. Decisions were made in tones that assumed privacy, and Mary stood within arm's reach of it all. She learned the tempo of the house, when Davis received visitors, when tensions ran high, when arguments grew careless. She learned which rooms held strategy and which held ceremony, which voices mattered most, which moments offered opportunity. To perform invisibility requires discipline, not too quick, not too slow, not too attentive, not too distant. A servant must seem occupied but not curious, present but not absorbing, listening but not retaining. Every glance had to be measured, every movement calibrated. And beneath that composed exterior, her mind worked steadily, cataloging, organizing, storing. She was not improvising each day. She was building a quiet archive within herself. The risk was constant. Discovery would not have meant dismissal. It would have meant imprisonment, perhaps execution. And yet she returned each morning, calm, unremarkable. There is a particular courage in that kind of repetition. Not the sudden charge into danger, but the sustained willingness to step into it again and again. Information moved northward because she made it move. Battles shifted because someone in Richmond listened carefully. History rarely records the steady heartbeat behind great events. But without that heartbeat, momentum falters. It is difficult to measure exactly how much Mary Bowser's intelligence altered the course of the war. Records were destroyed. Mary herself later attempted to burn evidence of her work to protect others. But Union officials acknowledged that a spy within Jefferson Davis's own home had provided invaluable intelligence. Consider the reversal embedded in that truth. The Confederacy's president discussing strategy while a formerly enslaved black woman stood nearby, absorbing everything. This was not merely espionage. It was moral inversion. The system that declared her inferior relied on her silence. She weaponized that silence. In a society built upon surveillance of black bodies, she became the observer. She did not argue, she did not announce, she did not seek recognition. She listened, and she remembered. Memory became resistance. Observation became strategy. Invisibility became shield. But invisibility, no matter how carefully worn, cannot last forever. Even silence can begin to echo. Eventually, suspicion grew. Rumors circulated that information was leaking. Wartime breeds paranoia. Officers questioned one another. Letters were scrutinized, movements monitored. The Confederate leadership did not immediately suspect a servant, but tension thickened in the air. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Mary intentionally behaved in ways that drew suspicion, creating a reason to dismiss her before deeper investigation could unfold. Others suggest she fled Richmond before she could be captured. One story claims she attempted to set fire to the Confederate White House before escaping. Whether legend or embellishment, the symbolism resonates. A woman who had moved unseen through corridors of power slipped away before she could be punished. And then, for decades, history lost her. She disappeared from official records. No dramatic trial, no public recognition, only absence. And when the smoke of war began to clear, the world she stepped into was no simpler than the one she had left behind. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Mary Bowser's trail grows faint. Some sources suggest she traveled. Others indicate she may have lectured about her experiences. There are hints she may have written memoir-like accounts that were never widely preserved. But many documents were lost, others destroyed intentionally. Part of this was protection. Part of it was neglect. Black women's stories have often been the easiest to erase. And yet fragments survived. Letters referencing a highly intelligent operative, government acknowledgments, oral histories preserved in pieces. Enough to confirm this. There was a spy inside the Confederate White House, and she was not who they believed her to be. Time moved on. Governments shifted. Battles were recorded and remembered. Yet her story lingered quietly at the edges. The war had ended, but peace did not arrive gently. Richmond bore the scars of conflict, burned districts, fractured families, uncertain futures. Reconstruction brought new laws, new tensions, new promises that did not always reach those who needed them most. For formerly enslaved people, freedom required navigation. Work had to be found, homes had to be secured, communities rebuilt from fragments. And for someone like Mary, a woman who had operated in secrecy, there was another layer of complexity. How do you return to ordinary life after standing so close to history's turning point? How do you carry knowledge that cannot be spoken freely? How do you explain years of careful deception to a world that prefers simple narratives? Some accounts suggest she traveled north. Others hint that she lectured about her experiences. There are references to a woman of remarkable intelligence speaking publicly about the war from a perspective few possessed. But documentation thins, records fade. This is not unusual. Black women's histories in the 19th century were rarely preserved with care. Their labor was recorded, their resistance was not. Yet absence does not mean insignificance. It means the archive was incomplete. Somewhere in the years after the war, Mary continued living, rising each morning, speaking to neighbors, walking through streets that had once bristled with soldiers. Perhaps she carried her memories quietly. Perhaps she shared them in trusted company. Perhaps she chose privacy over recognition. What we know is this: She survived a role that could easily have ended her life. She outlived the Confederacy she had quietly undermined, and she moved forward in a nation still struggling to redefine itself. Reconstruction was not restful. It was contested, fragile, uneven. But within that instability, people like Mary persisted. Persistence can be as significant as heroism. Endurance can be as radical as rebellion. And though the details of her later years remain uncertain, the impact of her wartime courage did not vanish with paperwork. It remained woven into the broader story of Union victory and Confederate defeat. Mary Bowser did not command armies. She did not give famous speeches. She did not sign treaties. Her power was quieter. She understood something profound. In a society built on hierarchy and assumption, perception can be manipulated. Expectations can be reversed. They expected ignorance. She cultivated insight. They expected obedience. She cultivated awareness. They expected silence. She transformed it. History often celebrates generals. It builds statues for presidents. It names battles after men. But wars are also shaped by those who move unseen. And sometimes the most radical act is not loud rebellion. It is careful attention. And so we let her story settle for a moment, allowing the quiet weight of it to rest gently before we continue. She was not the loudest person in the room, not the one giving orders, not the one whose name would be printed in headlines. She was unassuming, careful, diligent. And yet it was that very diligence, that steady attention, that disciplined memory, that quiet cleverness that helped shape the outcome of events far larger than herself. History often turns on moments that seem small at the time, a detail remembered, a weakness noticed, a pattern understood. Mary Bowser did not command armies, but through patience and perception, she influenced the flow of information that armies depend upon. And sometimes, that is enough to alter the course of history. There is something quietly profound about a life that alters events without demanding acknowledgement. Mary Bowser did not wait for permission to matter. She did not wait for applause. She acted within the narrow spaces available to her. In doing so, she reminds us that influence is not reserved for those with titles. It can belong to anyone willing to pay close attention. Think for a moment about the nature of attention. To truly observe requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires the humility to remain still while others speak. Mary's strength was not theatrical. It was disciplined, measured, intentional. She understood timing. She understood restraint. She understood that the right moment, quietly seized, can outweigh grand gestures. And perhaps that is why her story feels especially fitting for this quiet hour. Because in the stillness of night, when noise fades and urgency softens, we recognize the value of steady presence. Not every life needs to be loud to be meaningful. Not every contribution needs to be visible to be powerful. Sometimes history bends because someone noticed what others ignored. Sometimes outcomes shift because someone remembered what others forgot. Mary Bowser's life is a reminder that dignity does not depend on recognition. Worth does not require applause, and courage can exist in silence. As the fire settles lower and the room grows softer around you, let that idea rest gently. Quiet strength matters. Steady minds matter. The patient observer matters. And somewhere, beyond the headlines and monuments, history carries the imprint of those who listened carefully when it counted most. When we think of courage, we often imagine noise, raised voices, bold declarations, public defiance. But there is another form of courage, quieter, steadier, almost invisible. The courage to remain composed when you are underestimated. The courage to endure misjudgment without correcting it. The courage to hold knowledge without revealing its weight. Mary Bowser lived inside that quiet courage. She understood that power does not always belong to the loudest presence. Sometimes it belongs to the most attentive one. In rooms where others spoke freely, she listened without interruption. In systems designed to diminish her, she recognized opportunity. In a world that declared her incapable, she cultivated excellence. How many others moved through history this way? How many names dissolved into margins because their strength did not shout? History often preserves the signatures of those in command. It rarely preserves the heartbeat of those who observed. And yet the observer can alter outcomes as surely as the general. Tonight, as the fire settles lower and the air grows still, consider the quiet people who have shaped the world without recognition. The teacher who changed a life with patience. The worker who noticed a flaw others missed. The person who listened carefully and acted wisely. Impact does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves softly. Mary Bowser's life reminds us that attention itself can be an act of resistance. Memory can be a form of protection. Composure can be strategy. She was unassuming. She was diligent. She was clever in ways that did not demand applause. And through those qualities, she influenced events far beyond the room in which she stood. In the end, it is not always the visible force that shapes the future. It is often the patient mind, the steady presence, the one who listens carefully while others speak too freely. And that, perhaps, is the gentlest kind of power. Imagine her sitting in a quiet room years later. No uniforms, no maps, no hurried whispers in hallways. Just memory, the weight of what she carried without paper, the knowledge that history might never call her by name. She had stood inside the very heart of Confederate power. She had listened as history unfolded. She had risked execution if discovered. And she survived. The night grows quieter. The world beyond this moment continues, unseen and distant. Mary Bowser reminds us that resistance does not always shout. Sometimes it memorizes. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it walks silently through a room and leaves with everything it needs. The air grows still. The quiet deepens. And somewhere in the shadows of history, a woman sits, not invisible anymore, not forgotten. Remember her name, Mary Bowser. Perhaps this is the quiet gift of stories like hers. They remind us that history is not only shaped by those who stand at podiums or ride at the head of armies. It is also shaped by those who notice, those who remember, those who move carefully through complicated rooms and leave them changed. Mary Bowser did not live for recognition. She lived with intention. And sometimes, intention is enough. As the fire softens and the hour grows later, let her story settle not as spectacle, but as reassurance, that even in systems built to silence, intelligence endures, that even in rooms built to exclude, perception finds its way in, that even when unseen, a steady mind can alter the course of events. Some lives are loud, others are luminous. Mary's was the second. And in the quiet, luminous lives of people like her, history continues to turn. She stood in rooms where secrets burned and heard the tides of battle turn. They saw a servant small and slight. She carried memory into night. In silence sharp as any blade, she shaped the course their whispers made. No trumpet marked the path she trod. No marble bore her name in stone. Yet in the hush of firelit halls, she answered history's hidden calls. And where they thought no mind would rise, she watched with steady, knowing eyes. and so we leave her there tonight. If this story brought you calm or quiet curiosity, you're always welcome to return. There are more true stories like hers, real people whose names were nearly lost, whose courage moved quietly through history, and we will visit them, one story at a time. For now, rest well.